Hello, I am Lindsay Yoder. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. I'm also the Aquatic Programs Coordinator for Teatown Lake Reservation in Ossining, New York. And every season I manage a crew, the Aquatic Invasive Strike Force, that goes to lakes all around the region and conducts submerged aquatic vegetation surveys as well as water chestnut removals. And we primarily focus in our surveys on invasive plants. So in the 2019 season, we did 2 surveys of Chodikee Lake, and we also did 1 water chestnut removal. So for this presentation, I just want to go over some of the basics about invasive species and then go into more detail about our process, how we do these surveys, and what our long-term goals are as far as extending from Chodikee Lake into Black Creek as well, specifically with water chestnut management. So just for anyone who doesn't know much about invasive species, I do want to give an overview. Invasive species are more than weeds, and this is a common issue, is a lot of people look at species that are maybe overtaking an area and they just assume it's invasive. But it's not just a weed. There are a few very important distinctions that need to be made. First, there are native species. These can also be obnoxious and problematic. There are a few native species that can be problematic, like coontail is one, bladderwort is another. These are aquatic plants that do form very dense colonies and can be annoying, but those are native plants. This plant here is Vallisneria americana, or water celery or eelgrass, and this is a plant commonly used in aquatic habitat restoration efforts because it's very good habitat. This is an example of a native plant. Then we also have non-native plants. Now, non-native plants do not necessarily become invasive. Just because a plant is non-native does not mean it's invasive. So an example of this is many of our cultivated species, especially crops and agriculture like apples, corn, and then some horticultural species like tulips or pansies. These aren't native species, but they also don't form the same ecological or other impacts that invasives do. And then we have noxious plants. Now, noxious plants can be native and they can also be invasive. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is poison ivy. So poison ivy is a native plant, but it's noxious. A lot of people might think that poison ivy is also an invasive plant. So here's the definition. An invasive plant is a non-native species which causes or has the potential to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And this is what's important about invasive species because, as I said, not all non-native species become invasive. The distinction being, does it cause any sort of harm? If it doesn't, then it's not usually considered an invasive species. So to go into that definition just a little bit more. Non-native, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's only non-native to the United States. There are several species that are non-native to just our region or non-native to just other regions. So one example of that, the sea lamprey. This species is native here in the Hudson Valley. It's native to the Hudson River, but it's actually invasive in the Great Lakes. Variable leaf milfoil. This is a plant that is native to a lot of different areas of the United States, mostly parts of the Midwest as well as the southeastern United States, even as far up into southern New Jersey, but it's not native to New York. So these are just a couple of examples of how a species can be regionally invasive, not necessarily nationally invasive. They cause environmental, economical, or human harm. So it doesn't have to cause all 3 of these, but there are species that do. The zebra mussel is one example of an aquatic invader who negatively impacts many different components. As a filter feeder, it depletes plankton from the water column, removing available food for smaller fish that in turn feed sport fish prized in the recreational fisheries. So there's its economic damage. And then as it filters the water, it can also deposit high concentrations of toxins that it doesn't consume, such as PCBs, which are a big problem in the Hudson River. And then those PCBs can then be found accumulating in the fish that we eat. So there's how it harms human health. Now, not all invasive species will impact all of these different sectors, but of course there are some that do. And then this is not part of the actual definition, but it's something that's important to consider, and that negative impacts outweigh the benefits. There are a lot of invasive plants that might have some benefits. There are a few specific aquatic plants that can tolerate conditions that native plants can't. So, you know, especially in turbid or polluted waters, there are quite a few species that might provide habitat in the absence of those native plants. But a lot of times the negative impacts outweigh those benefits. A lot of these species can form really dense colonies, so the benefit of having it kind of is outweighed by the fact that it starts crowding out the fish or other smaller animals that it was initially intended to be habitat for. Phragmites is a really good example. It does provide habitat for some bird species. It is a fairly decent buffer for erosion control, but native cattails provide a lot more habitat for a lot more species, and Phragmites outcompetes native cattails. So one common question that a lot of people ask is, why is a species invasive, or how does it become invasive? Because as I mentioned, not every non-native species becomes invasive. So there are three major things. There are others, but here's the three that I want to discuss. One is propagule pressure. So this is just the concept of the amount of a species that's introduced. Now it's very uncommon that only one plant or only one animal is going to be introduced into a system. There's usually several different occurrences of the same species being introduced, and that's what's going to contribute to its success. But there does need to be a certain amount of propagules introduced for a non-native species to even have the chance of becoming invasive. If you were only going to have one individual be introduced, it's not likely that it's going to be able to reproduce and continue spreading. Another factor is due to that contributes to not necessarily becoming invasive is due to certain environmental parameters that a species needs to survive and reproduce, such as water temperature, diet, or salinity. So a tropical freshwater fish that only eats fruits and seeds found in their native stream may be limited by the colder brackish water of the Hudson River and the absence of their preferred diet. And in such a case, that species would be considered a specialist. But invasive species, on the other hand, are usually generalists. They've been able to survive, reproduce, and spread due to their tolerance of a wide range in environmental conditions, which is what makes them so problematic. And being a generalist and having that increased propagule pressure allows the species to be strong competitors and outcompete native species. So now let's go into specifically aquatic invasive species and what makes them a little bit different from terrestrial. There are a few things, but just take a look at these two images. These are both terrestrial habitats. One is obviously a forested area, one is on top of a mountain. Now in this forested area, this is covered with an invasive plant called multiflora rose. And if you know how to identify the plant, you know that this plant is here. It's very easy to see. It's overtaken the entire forested area. Contrastly, we have this, more mountainous area. It doesn't have as many plants, but that means maybe you'd notice when something new pops up. And now let's look at this. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see this? Is it, wow, look at all those invasive plants? No, it's not. This is actually the Hudson River. And as you can tell, it's very difficult to see what invasive plants are there. Invasive plants can go very easily undetected when they're in the water. Now, the Hudson River has an estimated over 150 invasive species, but you wouldn't be able to tell that just by looking at this picture. And that's what makes aquatic invasive species very problematic. If you've ever watched anything about invasive species, you've probably seen this. But essentially, as time goes on, an infestation grows larger and the control costs get higher. But especially for aquatic invasive species, public awareness typically begins very, very late in an infestation. It's not being detected early, so eradication is unlikely in most situations with aquatic invasive species, which is why it's so important that you learn how to identify them and you report them as soon as you find them. And that's kind of why my crew exists, is to try and be an early detection team to catch some of these infestations early and save the cost and save the harm to the environment. Let's go over some vectors. Obviously, invasive species can be introduced through a number of different mechanisms known as vectors. For aquatic invasive species, the primary vectors for species introduction usually depends on whether the species was brought here on purpose or by accident. So some intentional reasons for species introductions are through aquaculture, either as food for human consumption or for use in recreational, like stocking purposes, or as bait, food for other native species, and sport fish. We also bring them here as aquaria or for the ornamental trade. That includes animals and plants. And then we also introduce species for biological control of other invasive species like the grass carp seen in this image. But there are also intentional pathways, and these are some of the more robust ways that species are introduced. And in many cases, these species are not introduced intentionally into a natural system, but they're able to escape containment. So the major way that aquatic invasives are introduced is through ballast water from international cargo ships. That water is used to keep ships afloat, and when they come into port, they have to let that water out. So they're bringing water from other countries into ports of the United States, and that's how a lot of plant fragments as well as larval animals are introduced. The species are also able to spread through interconnected canals. A lot of species are initially introduced into the United States through the Great Lakes region, but they're able to reach the Hudson region through the Erie Canal. And then, of course, we have natural disasters like hurricanes and tsunamis. There are several cases, particularly out west, where tsunamis have brought entire infrastructure out to sea and across the ocean to California from Japan that have invasive species attached to them. So as I mentioned, an invasive species might not directly impact the environment, the economy, or the human health all at once, but in many circumstances, these impacts are all connected through the interference with services that the environment provides for us. These are known as ecosystem services. They include many things like primary production, food and fresh water availability, water quality, and recreation or aesthetic value, among many others, as you can see here in this diagram. Very rarely will an invasive species impair some component of Hudson River ecology without additional consequences to our everyday lives. So here are just a few examples of some of the impacts that aquatic invasive species have. On the environmental level, they obviously compete with native species for food and habitat. They can predate on native species, causing food web disruption, and they can also impair the water quality. The zebra mussel, as I've already mentioned, is a big one in that sense because it filters out plankton from the water column, increasing the clarity, which a lot of people might think initially is a good thing. But there's a reason why certain water bodies look the way they do. There's a certain reason why the Hudson River is not clear, and that's because it's full of plankton that is needed to feed other species. From an economic perspective, invasive species obviously decrease property values and aesthetics. They cause damage to infrastructure. They cost the recreation and ecotourism industry. Most people aren't going to want to go fishing in a lake that has silver carp that jump out of the water and slap them in the face, which I don't know if you've ever seen that video, but I suggest you check it out if you haven't. It also pools funds from other projects, namely from endangered species restoration projects. Invasive species impact the endangered species in more ways than just taking away habitat. They take away funding, because to restore an endangered habitat, first invasive species might need to be treated. So that's costing extra money, which means that less projects get done. And from a human health perspective, there have been many cases of drowning from plant overgrowth, the bioaccumulation of toxins, as I mentioned with the zebra mussels and PCBs, the spread of parasites, physical harm. You know, the seeds from water chestnut and the shells from zebra mussels are very sharp and can pierce skin. They cause the proliferation of harmful algal blooms, and that's because, especially with plants, when they die back, they cause a lot of bacteria to come onto the scene and start decomposing. Those bacteria consume a lot of oxygen, creating low dissolved oxygen levels, which then further contributes to harmful algal blooms. Okay, so I would like to get into some identification. Now, we're not going to do too many plant IDs because it would be a very long video if I tried to introduce all the invasive plants to you all, but I want to talk about the major players. So Chodikee Lake only has 2 invasive species currently, which is really great and very unique for this area. And that's why we're working so hard to try and protect it. But then there are also a couple that I do want to be on the lookout for, because they are either high priority species or they are common everywhere else. And the fact that they are not in Chodikee is very interesting. So the first one I want to go over is water chestnut. Water chestnut is a tier 3 or established species in the Lower Hudson PRISM. What that means is it's, you know, found in a lot of different places, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible to manage, because in local infestations, it is possible to actually either eradicate or at least severely deplete the population. So we'll quickly go through the ID, because I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with it. But the leaves are triangular and serrate, so they have this deep, jagged edge. They are floating and arranged in this rosette, and that rosette can be very large, up to about the size of a dinner plate. It has 10 to 12 buoyant cord-like stems, up to 16 feet, but it does primarily like shallow water, even though it can grow pretty tall. It also has feathery roots. They look almost like other leaves. They're green or black, depending on what time it is in the season. So, water chestnut reproduces by these sharp seeds. Now, each rosette can have up to 20 of these seeds. There are 4-horned nutlets, and they develop on the underside of the plant. So just think about that a little bit. Each rosette can produce up to 20 of these, and each seed can produce 10 to 12 stems. You see where I'm going with this. This is why this plant is able to grow so quickly and spread so quickly. It's because of that exponential growth. And that's why management is so important. The seeds, when they are green, are living, but most of the time you'll see them wash up on shore. They'll be black, and that means that they're no longer viable. So it prefers shallow and... Okay, so curly leaf pondweed, this is a tier 4 species in the Lower Hudson PRISM. That means it's considered widespread, and we are not likely to eradicate it from the region. It is a fairly small infestation in Chodikee Lake, though, so there is some hope that it can be removed here. To identify it, it has rigid oblong leaves with wavy or serrate margins. A lot of people will say it looks like lasagna or bacon. The leaves are alternate and more dense toward the stem, so they form like a little bunch of leaves at the end of the stem. And they're typically semi-translucent, reddish green. You can't really confuse this species with any of the native pondweeds just because of this form. Most of them are not They don't have these wavy leaves. They don't have this translucent color. They're very unique. So you shouldn't necessarily confuse this with any of the native pondweeds that might be found in Chodikee. The stem can be up to 15 feet, but it does prefer shallower waters. It can tolerate fresh or brackish water, so it can tolerate some salinity. And this plant is really unique because of its phenology. It starts growing very early in the season. Normally, it starts growing in early May. It's been a very warm year. I've already seen it. I saw it starting in mid-April. So it's a very early growing plant. And then it produces 150 or so turions that drop in mid-July. That's these here. These are overwintering buds. So this plant dies back in July and drops these buds, and then they begin growing in their winter form. And so once the water gets a little bit warmer in that early spring, that's when the plant starts to really grow. And that's why it gets such a jump on the native species. Okay, Eurasian water milfoil. This is the plant that Chodikee does not have, which is really interesting to me. So Eurasian water milfoil is a tier 4 species in the Lower Hudson PRISM, so it's widespread, and at this point Chodikee Lake is the only lake that I have surveyed that does not have this plant. So it's very interesting that it's been able to not establish there, especially considering the amount of boat traffic that the lake gets. So this species can be identified by its 4 feather-like leaves that are arranged in a whorl along the stem, and they're widely spaced along the stem. There are other milfoils that also have the feather-like leaves arranged in a whorl, but they're going to be a lot denser and more clumped along the stem, less space. Each leaf is finely divided into 12 leaflets, and each leaf has a blunt tip. It looks like it's like a feather, and you took scissors and cut the tip of it off. The stem can be up to 9 feet long and is, brownish to green, but again, we don't really like to use color. It also can have small pink flowers on a spike in mid-June, and that spike is emergent, so it'll stick up above the water. But this is not common. It's very unlikely, and it's also not necessary to identify the plant. So Eurasian water milfoil likes fresh or brackish water, so it can tolerate salinity. It has a fairly wide temperature range. It loves disturbed areas, and it produces seed, but it primarily spreads through fragmentation. So if you break off just a tiny little piece of the plant, such as, if it's attached to a boat, that fragment can then be taken to another lake where it's able to establish a new population. And that's why it's been able to spread as successfully. Okay, hydrilla. This is another one that is only in one location that we know of currently in our region. So this is a tier 2 species. It's an emerging species, obviously not yet found in Chodikee Lake. So the leaves are lance-shaped and serrate, so they have jagged edges like little spines. They're not easy to see with the naked eye though, so you would have to get really close or use a hand lens. They're typically found in whorls of 3 to 5, usually 5. The stems can grow up to 25 feet, and they can grow several inches per day. So this species is another one that is able to quickly overtake native species. It is a fairly late growing plant. This doesn't show up really until September, even into October. It thrives in many different types of water. It's one of the most generalist plants you could find. It likes flowing or stagnant, nutrient-rich, nutrient-poor, salt water, fresh water. But it's important that you know some of the lookalikes for this plant because there are a few of them. It looks very similar to native Alodia, this one here on the end. This is obviously a native plant. There are a couple of species, Alodia canadensis and Alodia natalis. Both are technically native. So that one will usually have whorls of 3, and it doesn't have the serrations on the leaves. But hydrilla, very early in the season, in its growing season, it can look like Alodia if it hasn't, grown all of its leaves yet, or if you find a plant that's been broken up, it might only have 3. So it is very hard to distinguish them if you don't really know what you're looking at. But hydrilla, is an aquarium plant, so it's brighter, it's more hardy, whereas Alodia is, more natural looking and a lot wispier. And then Brazilian Alodia here in the end. This is another invasive, so if you find this is good to report as well. This is also a tier 2, and we haven't found it in many places. This has whorls usually up to 6 leaves, so it's got more leaves than hydrilla, and the leaves are a lot longer, and it's a lot bushier. All right, so now I want to get into a little bit about my crew, what we do, and what we've done on Chodikee Lake so far. The Aquatic Invasive Strike Force is a Trail Conference Conservation Corps AmeriCorps crew. So while I am hosted by Teatown Lake Reservation, my crew is actually hosted by the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, which is based in Mahwah, New Jersey. The mission of our crew is that we are committed to preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species through education and outreach to active users of New York's waterways, while supporting management efforts through early detection surveys. So in addition to our early detection and management, we also participate in the Watercraft Inspection Steward Program, where crew members are posted at boat launches and educate boaters about preventing the spread of aquatic invaders, as well as performing voluntary boat inspections. So major components of our crew is the monitoring segment, that's the surveying, management, particularly water chestnut removals, as well as professional development. We try and introduce all of our crew members to other people in the field so that they can get different ideas of what they can do for long-term employment. So the goal of our crew is to conduct submerged aquatic vegetation surveys throughout the Lower Hudson region, record invasive and native species, presence and absence, as well as abundance. And then we upload those results into our statewide database, which is IMAP Invasives, as well as our own database, and assist in management priorities. So now I'd like to show you just a short video clip of exactly how we run through our surveys. This map here, this is an example of what we use. This is the map we use for Chodikee Lake. We create this grid and put it over the lake, and that's how we reach all of the different locations. So check out this short video, and then we'll move on. In order to accurately map occurrences of aquatic invasives, the Aquatic Invasive Strike Force performs submerged aquatic vegetation surveys. This is especially important for early detection of new species, which can aid in rapid response for possible eradication of small infestations, and it also aids in management options for existing infestations. We perform surveys by first laying a grid over an entire lake and placing survey points every 60 meters, about 200 feet. We load these points into a GPS unit and navigate to each individual point, focusing on locations within the littoral zone. Once we arrive to a point, we perform 2 tosses of a weed rake and record the plant species we find. To perform a rake toss, we allow the rake to sink completely to the bottom before retrieving, to guarantee we have an accurate sample. Once the rake is retrieved, we record the overall plant density as well as percentages of each individual species. We collect any invasives we find, being careful not to toss any fragments back into the water. We repeat this process multiple times until the entire lake has been surveyed. All right, so once we pull the rake up and we are trying to determine density, this is kind of the scale we use. So we determine plant density on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being 0, and then we work our way up. So 1 is trace, and that's this first image here. Maybe it has 1 or 2 or 3 plants on the rake. 2 is sparse, and that's the second image here. 3 is moderate, that's the third image, and 4 is dense. And dense would be usually the whole rake is covered, you can't even pull it up. Sparse and moderate are a little bit trickier to determine. It is somewhat subjective, so it's not an exact science. But I think by using the number scale, it gives us a way to quantify the density of each plant. So these are the results for our surveys of Chodikee Lake. This is for, we do 2 surveys. So we survey once early in the season and once later in the season. So these are the results early in the season. And they are as expected, particularly when we're talking about pondweed. As I mentioned, pondweed is a very early growing plant. So we did this survey early in the season, I believe in early June or mid-June. So the pondweed was still there. And then when you look over at the results from the second survey, there is no pondweed, which makes sense because the pondweed will have died back and we wouldn't have seen it in our survey. So as you can see, the plant density is a lot different from early season to later season. The water chestnut beds are relegated to, the northern and southern ends. We didn't find it too much on the edges, mostly where it enters Black Creek and then on the other end of the lake. But yeah, other than water chestnut and curly leaf, we pretty much only found native species or nothing. Now I have a few theories on why there was nothing. The water did not have a very high Secchi depth, so we couldn't really see into the water, which means a lot of light probably isn't penetrating in. The lake is not very deep. At most, the deepest point, I believe, was 14 or 15 feet. So it wasn't necessarily that the depth was too much for plants to grow, but it was fairly turbid in the sense of not a lot of light was penetrating through into those central parts. And the native species we found, if you're familiar with the lake, I'm sure you know there's a lot of water lily and spatterdock or yellow pond lily. And then there's also bladderwort, which is another native plant, as well as coontail. Okay, so in addition to our surveys, we also did water chestnut removals of Chodikee Lake, and we kept those confined to this one section. And that's just because we were only able to do one this season. The water chestnut was found after our first survey, and then we were able to come back and do kind of an ad hoc removal, but it wasn't a pre-planned removal. So this season, we're hoping to do more than just the one, obviously. And hopefully we'll be able to get the entire population as well as in Black Rock Creek. And this is really important because when removing water chestnut, you have to remove it all. Removing a few plants is not really going to help contribute to decreasing the population. And that's because of the amount of seeds that it produces and the viability of the seeds. Timing is also really important. When removing water chestnut, it needs to be removed anywhere from mid-June all the way through July. But after that, especially once you get into August, the seeds begin to drop off. And once the seeds drop off, it's useless to remove the actual plant unless, you're trying to remove it to decrease the amount of biomass. If you have a nutrient problem, then you could still remove the plant for that purpose, but you're not really going to be actually doing anything for the size of the infestation. So we hope to do at least 2 full-day removals here this season, possibly more if other things get canceled. But yeah, last year we removed 2,000 plants, about 2,000 plants in one day. So I'm confident that we'll be able to do, and that was just with some of the crew members. So with the full crew, I think we're going to be able to make a much bigger dent in the infestation this season. Okay, so now I want to go over some terrestrial / wetland invasive plants, both ID and management opportunities. We were asked to put this together as well because I know there are several people who are interested in managing some of the terrestrial plants that are along the riparian corridor of Black Creek, specifically Japanese knotweed. So I do have some information on Japanese knotweed as well as a few other terrestrial or wetland plants that I think that you should be on the lookout for, and some management techniques. Now, I am not the terrestrial invasive program coordinator, so I don't have all of the information, but I do have his contact information at the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions about management, be sure and reach out to him and ask about the specifics with terrestrial plant management. So the first species is Japanese knotweed, and most people are familiar with this one. This is a Tier 4 species in the Lower Hudson PRISM. It is widespread. And just to quickly go over some identification. So the leaves are alternate and broad and very variable in shape. So they can be heart-shaped or more oval-shaped. The stems are tall, semi-woody, and look kind of like bamboo with those you know, the different growth rings. They can get really tall, 3 to 10 feet tall, and they die back in autumn. The flowers appear from July to September, but the seeds within the flowers are not its primary mode of reproduction. Its primary mode of reproduction is through fragmentation and spread by rhizomes. That's why you get these sprawling populations, and that's because the rhizomes beneath the sediment or in the soil are able to spread out and form new sister plants. Now, there are a few other species of knotweed. There's giant knotweed and Bohemian knotweed, and some of these management techniques may apply to those as well, but these are primarily for Japanese knotweed, which is the more common plant that you'll find along riparian areas. Okay, so for management, some manual methods. Pulling or digging is one that a lot of people try to do, but it's ineffective due to those rhizomes. If you pull the plant and you don't get the entire rhizome, you're not really going to be making any sort of dent in the population, because new stems are just going to sprout up. The rhizomes have to be removed, and the rhizomes are really hardy and deep, so it's hard to actually remove those. Mowing might be effective in shrinking an infestation just due to, exhausting energy reserves, but it needs to be done 3 or so times per season. Some chemical options, which I will say you have to be a licensed pesticide applicator to do any sort of chemical treatments, especially if you were going to try and do it in a wetland area. So obviously people can't just go out and start doing these treatments, but there are a few options. So foliar spray, where you would cut the stems of the knotweed and then apply glyphosate after 3 weeks after being cut. There's also cut stump, which is similar. You cut the stems, but then you actually drip the solution into the stems over a longer period of time, and then later follow up with foliar spray. And there's also stem injection, which is a lot more efficient because you are doing essentially the same thing, but you're not having to cut first. So you literally inject the herbicide into the stem using a similar to a needle, and as you would inject anything. But I should also note, knotweed is one of the most notoriously difficult plants to treat, and that's due to those rhizomes that are able to spread and form new sister populations. So it is very difficult to treat. Okay, yellow flag iris. I did not see any reports of this in the area, but this is also a Tier 4 plant in the Lower Hudson region, very common. It looks very similar to a native iris, so to actually distinguish it, you would need the flower. The leaves are flat and sword-like or pointed with a raised midrib. They can be dark green to even like a dark bluish green in color, and up to 35 inches tall. The flower is bright yellow or cream colored, and that's on a stalk, which is a little bit taller than the rest of the leaves, so up to 40 inches. And those flower from May to July, but usually only in the 3rd year of the plant growth. So the first couple of years, you might not see flowers, and that's going to be really hard to distinguish the plant during that time. So it's able to spread because it has this buoyant seed pod, which you can see in this 4th image here. That seed pod's able to break off and then spread, of course, through currents or by waterfowl, especially if they're, right on the stream bank. Those seed pods are able to just drop off and float downstream, and they contain hundreds of seeds. It also has this fleshy rhizome, which is viable up to 10 years. So again, another plant where if you're not removing the entire thing, that rhizome is going to be able to continue growing new plants year after year. And it can even survive being dried out for, I think, up to 3 years. So management for this one, manual methods, pulling and digging can be effective for very small patches, but of course you need to get the rhizome. But if you're catching it early and you just see, a few plants, you could probably pull them and get away with it. Mowing can also be effective because, again, you're exhausting the energy reserves, but it needs to be done multiple times per season. Chemical, one of the only ways that is effective is using foliar spray, so cutting the stems and applying glyphosate after 3 weeks. Lesser celandine. So this is a tier 3 or established species in the Lower Hudson PRISM, but it is underreported. So there are very few actual reports of infestations of lesser celandine, especially in the region near Chodikee, but it's a lot more common than we believe it to be, or that we see it to be. So this is a low-growing plant where the leaves are in a basal formation. So that's where all the leaves originate from one location, similar to a cattail. The leaves are dark green and can be mottled. They're glossy and heart-shaped with wavy edges. These are very early season plants, so you'll see these from February to June. The bright yellow flower is on a long stalk. It's like a little bit taller than the rest of the plant. And it also has these underground tubers and bulbets, which are spread through water currents and then by burrowing and digging animals. Manual for this, pulling and digging obviously is possible for small infestations, but you have to get all of those tubers and all of those bulbs, and you can't leave any of it behind to get left to float downstream and form new populations. Chemical foliar spray can be effective in late winter, early spring, preferably before amphibians and other wetland species start appearing, just so they aren't affected. Because this is such a low-growing plant, they're more likely to encounter it. And then it needs to be followed up after 3 weeks of treatment. Flowering rush. This species is very new to our region. It's currently a tier 2, and that's only because we found one plant in Harriman State Park. So we haven't found it anywhere else. So this is reed-like and tall, up to 5 feet. Without the flower, it's going to look like every other wetland reed-like plant. If you're not looking close, I mean, it can look like the iris we just looked at. It looks like phragmites, looks like cattails. I mean, without the flowers, and if you're just looking, it's going to be really hard to distinguish. But the leaves are narrow, and again, they are basal from a rhizome. And those leaves can either lay flat if they're in shallow water, or they can stand tall if they're in fairly deep water. So this plant is one of the only true wetland plants. It can actually be found in the water. All of the others are going to be a little bit more upland, but still like moist soils. So the inflorescence on this plant is umbel-shaped, and it contains several pinkish to white flowers that bloom from July to September. Management for this. So pulling and digging, again, is possible for small single plants, but you have to get all of the rhizome. Cutting If you cut below the water surface, it will slow the growth, but it needs to be done several times over the season because new stems can pop up from those cut stems. Chemical is really difficult because the leaves are a lot narrower than some of the other wetland species, so the herbicide doesn't necessarily stick to the leaves as well. It kind of just is able to flow right off. But if it's on more upland banks and not necessarily in the water, there's a better chance of the herbicide, flowing down maybe to the base of the plant and being able to actually, stay there and treat. All right, so that's it for the presentation. A few caveats talking about terrestrial plant management. It's really important that you understand most of the management that you do on terrestrial plants is going to have to be a combination. Just manual removal isn't going to be as effective. Just herbicide is not going to be as effective as doing them in conjunction with one another. It's always going to be a combination of the two. That's the only way you're really going to, be effective in removing a population. If you want to just hold it back, of course, you can maybe just choose one or the other, but really using them together is the best option. And when you're removing any of these plants, if you're using manual removals, it's really important that you always remove all of the fragments, all of the rhizomes, anything that would be able to float downstream and form new populations. It's crucial that you take them off-site, solarize them, and dispose of them properly. Otherwise, you're just creating a more likely chance of creating new and larger populations. So that's everything I have. Of course, if you have any questions about aquatic invasive species or anything having to do with aquatics, feel free to email me. You can also email Ryan Gulick at the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference if you have any questions about terrestrial species, either identification or management. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.